Radio for February 27th, 2015. We've had to take time off the air for the last 3 weeks to properly do investigation in the case of Reverend Edward Pinckney. We've all been doing a lot of press and media after being called Syriza's sister party in America. The ACLU came to our defense in the case of Reverend Pinckney this morning and submitted a brief that his charge is a misdemeanor, as a precedent was set in another case 3 months ago by the Michigan State Court of Appeal. Even with the ACLU submission, both motions were denied by the Berrien County Court, or as we call it, Barbarian County. They said that this was not a misdemeanor and denied him bond. The Reverend was then sent back up to Marquette Prison, all the way at the edge of the northern Michigan border where it's freezing. Also, in the last 3 weeks since we were on the air, our sister party Syriza won the Greek elections and took over the government. It was just a few years ago that they were a handful of activists handing out flyers on the street. Now they've taken over the government. I direct you to an article on 21st Century Wire by Stuart Hooper titled, Tax Wall Street Party, the American Answer to Syriza. We are joined tonight by Dr. Webster Tarpley to talk about our party in the context of the larger political landscape. Next week, we will have a full episode on Reverend Pinckney with the party lawyers when we have all the details and the dust has settled. Now we turn to Dr. Webster Tarpley for a full political analysis and report.
Thank you, Daniela. Look, it's been about a month since Syriza, the Greek United Left Party, won the election and became the government in Athens, and they have formed a government with Alexis Tsipras as prime minister, Yanis Varoufakis as the finance minister, and some others, right? There's Kaminos, the defense minister. This, of course, is a qualitative watershed.
And it was a monumental event for our party and for yourself.
Our hats go off to the man or woman in the arena, right? So that's these people. But I think we've tried to tell the story of what has happened so far with Syriza and Tsipras and Varoufakis, and we'll continue to tell that because we've got to beat back the slanders that are coming from the Maoists and the Trotskyists and the Marxists and the LaRouches and the World Socialist website and this entire collection of sects and splinter groups and so forth. But I think we ought to take a look at the broader world picture for a minute and see what the organizing implications of all this are, the events of 2015 so far, if you will. What are the implications for the organizing process as we look ahead through 2015 and into then 2016? Well, can I just reel off a few that occurred to me and see what you think?
Yeah.
All right. The first one is just about Syriza, right? I think the obvious thing with that is Syriza is a party that advanced on the strength of mass traction economic demands. And these were not the wish list or the dream list of the petty bourgeoisie. They're not good government demands in that sense. Rather, these are working class demands. These are for working families. It's a tax reform from the bottom up. It's something that starts with the 30,000 families in Greece that are in worst shape, who need homes. They need everything, but they're homeless. And then this somewhat larger group of 300,000 families who have maybe some place to live, but they don't have electricity, they don't have food, they don't have medical care. And it starts with all of those.
Urgent, objective humanitarian necessity.
That's right. And we have that now, too, right? We have the humanitarian crisis in the United States largely revolves around water in Detroit and other parts of Michigan. Mm-hmm. But there are also others. There's a homelessness crisis, right? There's a lack of housing all over the United States. We have absolutely analogous problems, sometimes worse than what you have with the Greeks. So
I read that 40% of the homeless population in New York City are working 40-hour-a-week minimum wage jobs.
Yeah, so you can see how pervasive that is. But nevertheless, in spite of all the evidence that you're citing, look at the wretched quality of the various groups, right? You can look at the Progressive Democrats of America, right? Or MoveOn.org. They respond to the needs of George Soros, not to the needs of working people and families that are fighting for their survival. And then we look at the little splinter parties, something like the Green Party, right? You can imagine whether Jill Stein is concerned with the homeless in the United States, right? She's concerned with polar bears, penguins, and the snail darters, but not so much about actual human families that are living in this terrible situation. So the big lesson for the American opposition, right? If you think you're a progressive or a leftist, or if you're a libertarian, right? There's that too. You could say, do you have mass traction economic demands that address the life and death issues of working families? Because if you don't, you're irrelevant, and you have not learned the lesson of Syriza. Notice also.
Well, we have to be vigilant, because this week a few shows on RT called Jill Stein the American Syriza. That her run for president in 2016 was going to be akin to Alexis Tsipras, and we have to be careful people aren't going to buy this. We have to explain in detail why these two things aren't analogous.
Look, the Green Party is a profoundly right-wing reactionary institution. The first thing I have to say is, up there at Harvard, in the Harvard boutique, and in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology boutique, right, on the banks of the Charles, I guess it is. Now, Boston has been buried alive under, 90 inches of snow? I wonder if we're going to find quackademics with the chutzpah now to teach that there's global warming after this experience.
Well, I've been saying that for the last 2 weeks. Well, what about global warming? And they find a way to twist it because it's so deeply embedded in their ideology that they say, oh, you don't understand global warming. The thing is, because the ice caps melt, it shifts this and shifts that, and then it ends up getting colder. So I'm confused.
No, you're not confused. I think you're getting it quite clear, and that this is an attempt to muddy the globally warmed waters by these charlatans, right? They're charlatans, they're quackademics, they're Malthusians, they dance to the tune of the super rich. One of these people we have to point to is this guy Steyer, Steyer. By all accounts, this is the character who chose the issue of the Keystone XL pipeline to bet the ranch. Every eco-freak in the United States has got to be against this. And, of course, it's absurd because, as commentators have pointed out, the United States has 250,000 miles of pipeline, be it natural gas or oil or sometimes even gasoline. There are such things, absolutely. Or jet fuel. Those are also pipelines.
Can I ask a couple questions or one question about the pipeline? I can't figure out what their argument is. Why is it so bad?
It's argument. Forget the argument. It is that Tom Steyer gave the order to his minions, if you want money from me, you go against this.
I see.
And he was able to bring along with him the Sierra Club, the Canoe Federation, and God knows how many others, right? The Friends of the Earth, the Wilderness Society, it just goes on and on. These are groups for rich elitists. Their hobby is naturalism and so forth. Their contempt for the suffering human family, for the starving child, could not be more absolute. They are oligarchs, and they believe in oligarchy, and they've correctly identified global warming as the oligarchical issue par excellence of this part of the century. Because we know it's a fraud. We had the medieval warm period as a result of sunspot activity back around 1100, 1200, 1300, right, when the Vikings made it across the North Atlantic with colonies in Greenland and Newfoundland. That's the medieval warm period. It's the result of solar activity. The last two winters, we had a very severe winter in 2014, in January, February, March 2014. That was so bad that it impacted the growth of the U.S. Gross domestic product, and clearly we're having the same thing again. And as far as I can tell from the astronomical observations, the level of sunspots, which is a kind of a way to measure solar activity, has been declining rapidly over the last couple of years. Certainly there is no doubt as we go towards this Paris conference of rent seekers, that's the only people who want to get paid for professing these ideas, what you find is the scientific evidence is that there has been no increase in world temperatures for 15 years. And I would say the picture in the last 2 or 3 years is that it's getting colder. We just had this story Buffalo, New York, right, a very good place to take a sample, says that their temperatures now are lower than any time in the history of the city. In other words, any time we had records, out of all those records of Buffalo, New York, this past month has been absolutely the coldest. So it's a fraud, okay? But this is not even the issue now. I think anybody intelligent can see through this, right? This is for dupes, fanatics. It's a kind of religion. You got to go to these people and say, look, tell me one empirical event which would tend to disprove your theory, right? Because they say, oh, we have the empirical evidence. Tell us one empirical event that would disprove what you say. And ultimately, they'll never be able to tell you because they don't want this to occur. It's a religion, and it's a very inferior religion, right? It's a religion filled with all kinds of terrible, terrible problems. The main thing, of course, cruelty towards the developing sector. So I regard this as a dying cult. In other words, the theory of global warming is dying under 100 inches of snow in Boston.
But you're right when you call it a cult. That's closer to the truth almost than a religion, because a cult is built around the idea that the world's about to end and certain people have that information that everybody else doesn't. So that's how a cult is formed. That's the basics of it. So it's a cult.
It reminds us of Simon Magus in the late Roman Empire, right? This horrible guy, founder of Gnosticism. This is a Gnostic cult. Global warming is a fraud. There's no doubt about it. Okay? Mm-hmm. And generally speaking, remember Simon Magus's argument, right, in the Roman Empire, it was a time of, Nero. Simon Magus was, the world is coming to an end, but I can save you. Make checks payable to Simon Magus Enterprises. Right? And that's pretty much that's Gnosticism from then to now. But let's get back to the real world. Let's talk about now, Syriza has taught these lessons. And as far as I can see, we are principally the ones, we being Tax Wall Street Party, of which you are the chairwoman, and the United Front Against Austerity. These organizations are the ones that have actually studied Syriza and tried to figure out overwhelmingly what they've done right. And then they've also done a couple of things wrong. I would say what they've done wrong, this is sort of beyond their control. The wrong part is being in only one country of Europe. When I was organizing in Europe, right, I am the founder of an Italian political party and the co-founder of a German one. We started with the idea in the era of the European community, right, European Economic Community, European Union, European Central Bank, you've got to be all over Europe or you're nowhere, right? In other words, if the enemy, if you want the class enemy, is organized European-wide, you better be too. Okay, so Syriza doesn't have that. That's because in Italy, there's nothing.
We've learned that lesson at the Tax Wall Street Party. We have even international branches, even though we're just...
Yeah, we do. Right. Syriza doesn't have an interlocutor. They have this guy Mélenchon in France. This is what's left of the collapsed hulk of the French Communist Party. They used to have between 15-20%. No more, right? They're a sect. In Germany, we have Die Linke. Die Linke is mainly a protest movement against the Hartz workfare program, Hartz IV, which, by the way, proves that Germany is not an economic powerhouse, but it's a place that has about 10 million unemployed who are kept hidden and on terrible, terrible wages, terrible conditions. So Syriza is, for the moment, isolated. We've also devoted enough time, I think, to showing that the supposed partner, Podemos of Spain, under this character, Pablo Iglesias, that this is indeed, at least as far as Iglesias is concerned, a counterinsurgency operation. But this is Pablo Iglesias got famous because of the Soros media, the Huffington Post, the Berlusconi media, the controlled corporate counterinsurgency media are the ones that have put him on the map. And we've just seen him in New York. I'm sure you've talked about this on your show, right?
Yes.
With our intervention of our party. We asked them, do you support the 50% debt write-down, which is the leading demand of Syriza internationally? And he essentially said no. And we invited him to say, did you want to have the Spanish debt written down? And no answer, so it means no. He dodged it. And that's because he's not going to fight Santander and Bilbao and these infamous Spanish zombie banks.
Well, a lot of these lefties are jumping on the Iglesias bandwagon and bashing Syriza now.
You got to remember, what you learn from Obama is that those left liberal mushheads really want to be duped. They have a hunger to be duped. This is a complicated emotional mechanism, but...
Do you have any idea what you think what it comes from?
It's a compulsion. They want to be duped. And if you read my book, Obama, the Unauthorized Biography, we actually had a guy come and say, I know I'm being duped, but I like being duped, and I want to be duped again and again. Well, that may have, who knows what, psychosexual dimension.
The Iglesias thing smells just of the Obama campaigns. I mean, they have Si Podemos, which means yes, we can. And it's the same slogans, and it's the same...
And dreams, right?
And dreams.
I have to repeat my theory. When I heard Iglesias' speech at the Puerta del Sol a couple of weekends ago, he went through this whole thing about, we dream, but we take our dreams seriously. So sueños, right, the dreams. And somehow from sueños, he got himself to Don Quixote by Cervantes. And this struck me as an indication that the speech was written by a foreigner, some kind of, NATO counterinsurgency.
Oh, that's interesting.
Operative, because if you ask, as I understand it anyway, a literate Spaniard, what are the literary associations of sueños? It is, above all, the famous playwright Calderón de la Barca, who, after we have Lope de Vega, but in a slightly later time we have Calderón de la Barca, and his most famous work is this play, Toda la vida es sueño, sueños son sueños. So all of life is a dream, and dreams are dreams. But instead, this is less known to foreigners. In other words, everybody in the world knows Cervantes and Don Quixote. So I think that his speech, once again, at the Puerta del Sol, might have been written by somebody like Axelrod or Plouffe or Anita Dunn. In other words, one of these spin doctors from Connecticut Avenue, right? Power Alley here in Washington.
The Soros marketing team.
Yeah, sure. Here's the other thing with Syriza, right? We'll go through these demands. We'll keep going, right? I just have to make the point. All of these silly Maoists and Trotskyists, Marxists, LaRouche's World Socialist website, all this, they're all whining that the Syriza has sold out and that they had to make temporary maneuvers. It's just infantile, right? There's a text from the time of around the First World War about the infantile disorder that overtakes ultra-lefts when the going gets rough. And that's what you're seeing. It's interesting that they share this view with the Wall Street Journal.
It's the infantile disorder of all or nothing.
Yeah, that we want everything right away. Lotta continua, right? The Italian lotta continua was the most extreme form. Their slogan was, vogliamo tutto e subito. We want everything, and we want it now.
Now, yeah.
That was, as infantile as you could get, and that was lotta continua. The other things from Syriza, look, you have to have a program. We've talked about that. You have to have a strategy. The strategy is, once again, don't go for austerity. And I don't think they have. In other words, I think they've gotten as much anti-austerity as they could possibly get. You've got to have some leaders. I think, look at Tsipras, look at Varoufakis, right? Those are people of seriousness, of intelligence, of gravity. These are not teeny boppers. They don't come on the scene with a greasy ponytail.
They're also something we haven't seen in a while, which is men in service to a program. They're not in service to their own ego or their own career.
With Iglesias, it's clearly not a program. It's clearly that he's a narcissist.
Yes,
yeah. A mile away, right?
Yeah.
And we've seen that with Obama, right? Obama clearly a narcissist. Yeah. And you could see that a mile away.
He's almost like, he almost has the demeanor of like a Russell Brand type. Greasy narcissist.
A greasy narcissist. But now, question then is organization. Right? So I would, again, what we're trying to do, we of the Tax Wall Street Party, United Front Against Austerity, we're trying to gauge the responses of the various political groups in the United States, right? The people who claim to be anti-establishment in some way or other, to see, you can tell if they're viable, by the degree to which they respond to Syriza and how they do, right? Some of them say, oh, Varoufakis is groovy. I love Varoufakis, right? But it's obviously we need much more than this, and we've got to have some recognition of how they've done it. And so far, it doesn't look so good. I hope others will come forward as time goes on.
Nobody from my intelligence this week seems to understand the idea of program. Nobody's talking about the program. It's all very superficial.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's so. But again, that only means we have to redouble our efforts, right? Because if we can't carry the day on that, then it looks grim. But here's the other thing. Remember that Syriza is a unified collection of some pretty impotent pieces when you get right down to it. They've done wonders with very little. They started the groups that you hear from today, right? The ones that are complaining and whining and bitching. Mm-hmm. These groups are the Maoists, the Trotskyists, the old KKE, and remember there were two KKEs in the 70s, right, during the 60s to 70s, during the NATO military dictatorship, the junta in Athens, right, the Greek colonels. There were two communist parties. There was the KKE of the interior. This was the Brilakis group. And these were pro-monarchist. They were really right-wing. And they were, completely Euro-communist, right? They were looking to Ceausescu in Romania or the Italian Communist Party, Euro-communism. And then you got this other group, the KKE of the exterior. This was Kolianis. And this was some guy who lived in Prague or someplace like this, and he was very pro-Soviet. So the communists were split, Trotsky is split, Mao is split, Marx is split, and all this. The genius of Tsipras has been to get these, to meld them back together, right, to somehow reunite them and make them into a striking force. And I'm relatively confident that he'll be able to beat back this wave of complaining and whining that they're hearing. Like, you promised us the revolution on January 26th, and we haven't got it yet, and those nasty Germans are still blocking our path. Well, come on, get serious. The revolution is a struggle. You got to struggle sharply and protractedly, and the protractedly seems to have.
I'm confident that they're going to have the fortitude to march forward and stay the course.
Yeah, but above all, they've got to beat down these backward characters.
Well, we have to do the same thing here at the Tax Wall Street Party. We're going to have to do two things. We're going to have to, on the one hand, fight and differentiate ourselves, separate ourselves from these other splinter parties. Not that we're not a splinter party. We're going to have to separate ourselves from the splinter parties. And we're also going to have to recruit cadre, people who are lingering because they just never knew any better.
Yeah. Here's one that I do think is worthy of mention, right?
Okay.
I was listening to a very interesting commentary on the European situation, right? Because we've got Ukraine going on, right? We've got tremendous attempts by warmongers, neocons, humanitarian bombers, all these people, not just Susan Rice, but Samantha Power, right? She wants to bomb people for the human rights situation. One of the commentators said, well, if you look at the Minsk II Accords last week or two, the guy said, look, everybody in Europe can pretty much agree with that, right, apart from one group. He said there's only one extreme group that wouldn't agree with it. He said, yeah, that's the German Green Party. So here's the thing.
The warmongers.
The warmongers. And so this is the flagship Green Party in the world, okay? They have more representatives. They're in the Bundestag. They're in the German parliament. They actually had one of their members serve as foreign minister. That was a guy called Joschka Fischer. I had known him in the Frankfurt area in the 1980s. He was a champion of beating up cops. He was a street fighter. His big cause then was to stop the third runway of Frankfurt Airport. My God. But then he became foreign minister, and he's the guy who organized everybody to bomb Serbia. Right?
Why did he want to stop the third runway at Frankfurt Airport?
Because he's a green eco-freak, because it was disturbing the owls, or it was a great chance to go and beat up cops.
I figured it was something like that, but I was just making sure.
This wretched party is now there, and the head of it is Rebecca Harms. Harms, right?
Harms.
She's in harm's way. Remember it this way. Rebecca Harms is the head of the German Greens, and she's not just anybody. She was actually the European-wide candidate for the entire constellation of green parties in Europe, right? The eco-freaks of the old continent were looking to her. She didn't do too well, right? Syriza did. The pro-Syriza group did about as well as she did. So here's Rebecca Harms. This woman is the biggest Russophobe and warmonger and confrontationist in the German parliament. She's worse than the CSU of Bavaria, right? The Christian Social Union, the one that used to be Franz Josef Strauss, if you can remember him, extreme right wing. No, those guys are reasonable compared to the German Green Party. So here's my request. Jill Stein. You got to talk to me about two things, Jill Stein. This is the woman who has been the candidate for president.
She's running again in 2016, I think.
Okay, well, she's trying to, right?
Yeah.
I don't think she has their nomination yet, but she's running for herself. So there are two things. Jill, I want you to condemn Rebecca Harms as a warmonger and an enemy of peace because of her behavior in trying to provoke conflict and confrontation between Germany specifically and the Russian Federation under Putin. That's number one, because if we don't get that from Jill Stein, we have to assume that old Jill is just the same kind of right-winger as this Rebecca Harms. And then the second one, of course,
Israel.
is Netanyahu. Indeed, Netanyahu is coming to town. Netanyahu has demonstrated a degree of arrogance, impudence, and contempt for the United States, which is now beyond all limits. In other words, everybody knows what he did. He colluded with Boehner to get this invitation. It was supposed to be damaging to Obama. It's damaging to the U.S. presidency. But now, listen to this. The cringing bearers of water for the Israelis in the United States, right? Durbin and Feinstein and a bunch of other, pretty much all Democratic senators, said, look, Bibi, we know you're coming to talk to the joint session of Congress, but we Senate Democrats would like you to come and talk to us too. Okay? Mm-hmm. And the answer came back from Netanyahu, no, I'm not gonna dignify you with a visit. Right? So I don't understand this now. He says his goal is, he realizes that he's created a diplomatic protocol affront, but he says, I've got to do this because it's the future of the Israelis. Well, if it's really the future of Israel, then how can you not want to go and talk to these, minority but still quite influential Democratic senator? He's really, he has joined the Republican Party, right? So this means that both Netanyahu and the whole relation with Israel are now completely partisan. Jill Stein, will you be attending? Will you be in the visitors gallery when Netanyahu comes out and makes his speech? And remember what he said is, he says he wants to stop any deal between the United States and Iran. Any deal. He doesn't know what the deal is. Even Kerry said this today, right? Kerry says to him, Bibi, wait until there's a deal, then you can condemn it. But right now you don't even know what you're condemning. So Bibi is saying, I condemn any deal. This is very close to saying, I want the United States embroiled in a catastrophic war with Iran, which could then become a world war. The guy's a madman. In other words, he's one of these characters out of the July 1914, August 1914 collection of mental cases, right? And the other one is we even have, from the establishment side, last week, Zbigniew Brzezinski on the Morning Joe program said that Netanyahu is attempting to embroil the United States in a war with Iran. After all the United States has done for this adventurer, right, this demagogue, this tinhorn, Netanyahu, he feels free to do all this stuff. These are unfriendly acts. These are hostile acts. This is what you get persona non grata for. In other words, don't come here because we don't want you. I would say Netanyahu should be declared persona non grata. Don't come. Right? You're not welcome. Mm-hmm. And the United States ambassador in Israel should be called back for consultations, which is that's like a step short of breaking diplomatic relations. So I think, and the idea, the hope for that is Netanyahu is trying to use this entire circus to get himself reelected. There's this other guy, Lapid. I don't know anything about him. There's C.P. Livni. We've seen her in the past. Let's see what they can do, right? Let's get Netanyahu out.
Well, where does a woman like Jill Stein come from? Why is this the choice of a leader? Why is this a presidential candidate?
It's not encouraging, is it? No, but this is not a viable formation. Now, let's not spend any time on her. She's too little.
Yeah, exactly.
If she doesn't respond to our requests, then I think her future is grim. But now let's look at this. You know, this is a big weekend here in Washington. We have the Conservative Political Action Committee, CPAC, or as I call it, RPAC, right? Reactionary Political Action Committee. And that's the nicest thing I could say, right? We could have FPAC or some other thing, right? This is now going to be the parade of all the lunatic demagogues of the Republican Party. Jeb Bush of the CIA Bush faction, he's certainly an important contender because of that family machine and all that money. But now there's also Governor Walker of Wisconsin, the famous union buster, and I don't know if I can quite call him a book burner, but he's the guy who wants to demolish University of Wisconsin, right? One of the leading institutions here in the United States, right, of some note. Walker, I think, is powerful because he's gotten money from Koch. Jeb is powerful because he has the CIA Bush faction behind him, and they have maneuvered Romney out of the scene. Romney has his own CIA faction. That would be CIA Mormon Mafia. I'm trying to make sure people have read my book, Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America with Polygamy, Theocracy, and Subversion. I think what's going on there is there's a deal between CIA Bush and Mormon Mafia that if Jeb gets the presidency, then Romney will get maybe the vice presidency, maybe Secretary of State, or some other thing that he wants. Who knows what he wants? His wife might want to be, have the embassy in Paris or Rome or something like this. Okay, so we've got them. We've got Bobby Jindal. Walker is the guy, he's asked about evolution, and he says he wants to punt. Now, remember, evolution is proven. There's no doubt about evolution. The point of debate begins with Darwin, right? Darwin is a fraud. Darwin is a charlatan. Darwin is telling you that the entire universe is at random and that that God is a blind watchmaker. He's not a blind watchmaker. There is an inbred inherent tendency in the material universe towards higher levels of organization and energy. In other words, it's a Leibnizian least action universe, right? But this is beyond the ken of most of these. It's not that there's an intelligent design in the sense of some plan that God made. It's just that for whatever reason, the universe you see is a universe of self-development, and above all, of negentropy, that the organization of energy is improving, right, from the quasar to the solar system and to everything else we see. The empirical reality is that there's development. So anyway, Walker is out on that. He's too busy busting unions. Jindal is another one of these obscurantist scoundrels. Oh, Christie.
Is Chris Christie running?
Christie, well, sure. But he's been bashed. He has been put through the mill. As far as we can tell, the original Bridgegate scandal, although very real, right, he deserved everything he got, this was set into motion by CIA Bush in order to get him out of the picture. And then, of course, we have the dynamic duo in the clown car, which is little Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, right? These two buffoons try to outdo each other in the most barbaric forms of austerity or the craziest ideas. You've also got Trump. Speaking of crazy, Donald Trump is there. So we got all this going on. Now, by tomorrow, right, tomorrow being the 27th of February, we're going to have this question of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, you may remember, Obama did something which I thought was long overdue, right? It was too little too late, but it was something. Obama, back at the end of last year, put a stop to the wanton, cruel wholesale deportation of children or young adults who came up under they were brought to the United States in young years, and they had no influence over what happened, that some of them have now been legalized or allowed to stay under the DREAM Act, that their parents and relatives could also stay. And again, the basic idea is you're not doing these people a favor. They're doing you a favor, right? If the United States did not have this influx of primarily Hispanic immigrants, we would be having the same demographic breakdown crisis as China, Japan, Europe, Russia, most other places in the world are collapsing in their population. We're not, and it's thanks to the wonderful contribution of these people, right? The Republican, racist, xenophobic, reactionary view, they just can't grasp this, right? That somehow they need these people. Those are your economic future. You want to have a workforce about 2050, 2060? These are the people you're gonna need.
And it takes away from the idea of job creation and 30 million new jobs like we talk about, and they can just focus on immigrants took my job.
Yeah, but it's not even true, because a lot of these people, it's simply hatred. It's just pure, unadulterated hatred.
Yeah.
It's just animus, right? It's not that they lost the job. In many cases, they didn't. And I've told you, if you are worried about losing a job, what you need is a 10 to 15% protective tariff, forcing people to keep the factories here. Otherwise, you pay the tariff. Right? Mm-hmm. That would be 15% would be a protective tariff in today's world. Second point would be get rid of the Taft-Hartley Act and have the right to organize everywhere, including the backward southern states. And then the other one is, you want to keep your trade unions going. You want to have these other inputs. And if you do all that, right, between the protective tariff, the trade union movement, and the minimum wage, right? You've got to have something like a $15 minimum wage so nobody can undercut you. You can't go down that low because it's illegal to go down that low. So anyway, you can do all that. So Rand has profiled himself as a scoundrel, right? In other words, he's a flip-flopper. He's worse than Kerry or any number of others that are famous for flip-flopping, right? He said, I'm against drones, but then he was in favor of drones. He was anti-war until he found that the reactionary Republicans were swimming in the direction of war. And then Cruz is the same thing. Now, the thing with the Republicans right now is they said we're so angry that Obama has stopped these deportations that we're going to deny funding to the Department of Homeland Security. And this was built into that so-called Cromnibus solution at the end of last year. Well, this knot has now reached the comb, as you say, and as of tomorrow, if the House and the Senate do not send Obama a funding bill for the Department of Homeland Security, which is the Secret Service, the airport security, all this other stuff, then the Department of Homeland Security will shut down. Now, since everybody knows the Republicans are responsible for this, because they are, the Republican specialty is that they are the party of national sabotage, and what they're trying to do is to shut down this important, executive department, ministry. They think that that's politics, and it's especially about 80 to 90 lunatic fanatics, not just reactionaries, but I think proto-fascists or fascists. That is the Tea Party caucus of the House of Representatives. Right? They're the ones they're right-wing anarchists. They're absolutely full of hatred against government. So this is what they're trying to do. Right? They're not going to vote, I think, for any reasonable solution. So it's quite likely that by Saturday, the Department of Homeland Security will shut down. Now, many
but is that going to be all branches? They're going to shut down border security?
Many parts of it will shut down. Right. The administrative part shut down. But then they have the ones that are judged to be essential.
Okay, that's what I was saying.
They will keep working, but for no pay. So imagine the tensions in their homes and the wives and everything else, because they're working, they're paying for the commute, they got to get all the stuff, and they're getting no pay. Okay? And here's what I this is my prophetic vision of this thing. Remember that the necessary perspective is the destruction, the extinction of the Republican Party. The Republican Party has no reason to exist except the money from Koch from Sheldon Adelson, from any number of others, right? These super rich donors. Their actual apparatus is the country club, the Chamber of Commerce. They do have, some kind of structural articulation. But mainly, the thing that keeps the Republicans going is big, big money. And in the last election, in the 2012 cycle, it was above all the Koch brothers. Their millions and hundreds of millions and maybe billions, nobody knows. That's what keeps the Republicans going, right? So the Republican Party otherwise would be this regional party in the South and rural areas, reactionary, racist, xenophobic, whatever you want. They're a threat to the American future because these are people, if you say to them, let's build infrastructure. No. Let's have a space program. No. We don't want to be taxed, right? We're right-wing anarchists and money, 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 my money, my money. You get the idea. So now look, suppose the Department of Homeland Security shuts down on Saturday morning. Mm-hmm. And on Monday, a large terrorist event occurs. Mm-hmm. Because these are going on all the while right now. I think that this stuff with the Middle East terrorism has been fomented, of course, by the CIA, MI6, all the rest. But a lot of this stuff now is it's taken on a life of its own, right? It's acquired a momentum. It's a Frankenstein monster on the march. Or, somebody in Britain decides that they want to do it, or somebody in the French's deck, they decide they want an incident for their own reasons, and maybe they don't care too much about what happens to the Republican Party. But any significant terrorist event leading to dead Americans will be blamed on the Republican Party, and they will deserve it. And I hope very much that this can be the beginning of the end for the Republicans. Because you notice these days the Republicans are going around saying, Obama doesn't say the right words. Mm-hmm. When he talks about the Middle East, he doesn't say Islamic terrorism. He says armed extremism or extremist terrorism or something like that. So it's all pure nominalism, right? It's the nominalism of William of Ockham, that stupidest philosopher of the Middle Ages. But now what is that compared to? They're going to say, Obama, you didn't say the right words. So Obama can say, look, you cut off funding for the police, and now we have dead people, and you're responsible. Maybe Obama won't say that, but somebody will. And that could be the beginning of the end of the Republican Party. So I would urge the Democrats, don't make any concessions to those reactionary Republicans, because the people who have a life, an existential need to get out of this are those Republicans. Because if they go any further with this, you're going to see somebody like Cruz get hooted when he starts with his pontificating and his hypocrisy. They're going to ask him, how come you cut off money and those people die? That's going to be that. Okay, so that's the Republicans. Now, briefly, I don't know how much time we have.
We have 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay.
Yes.
Let's then do the Democratic side, and maybe the best way to get into this is Jeb and Hillary. If we were Plutarch, would we do parallel lives of these two? We might, I suppose, except they're not noble, right? To get into Plutarch, you're going to be noble. They're not.
But let's do parallel lives.
So Jeb Bush, this is just very much to the immediate point. Jeb Bush's biggest problem is that even though on the world scale and any kind of historical scale, he's a reactionary, he's a hard-line reactionary Republican, he feels that he's vulnerable because there are others that are more reactionary than he is, like that Walker was a bigger union buster. Rand, especially Cruz, is crazier. Right? Jindal is crazier. Christie is more brutal. So Jeb doesn't want to be a softie. So he's afraid if he gets judged on immigration, Common Core, things like this, he's going to get slammed in these primaries, right? No matter how much money he has. So what he's done is to say, well, the one area where I can reinvent myself is foreign policy. So he says, I'm going to be the biggest and most extreme warmonger of the whole pack. I will not allow anybody to get to my right on foreign affairs, not even Cruz. And that's what he says. He gets out there and he says, I love my brother, I love my father, but I'm my own man. I was going to ask him, do you love your grandfather, Prescott, the Nazi, the guy who financed Hitler? Do you love him? But anyway, he loves his father, he loves his brother, but he's his own man. And then he starts with a policy which is more extreme than Bush the younger. And we have to remember, Bush the elder, my God, was a huge warmonger. He's the one who set the United States on this series of catastrophic Middle East wars, right? With that business with Saddam Hussein and Kuwait, right? That was mad as a hatter. Please read the unauthorized biography of George Bush by me. You can get this at Tarpley.net. Okay, so Bush is all the way extreme warmonger. Now Hillary, as soon as we pose the question, it's answered, right? We know that Hillary, because of her peculiar theory of feminism, Hillary believes that unless she is the biggest warmonger on the scene or in the room or whatever it is, that she will be ridiculed as a weak woman, right, as a weak vessel. So Hillary is the mirror image of Jeb in the sense that she's got to be the most extreme warmonger in the entire Democratic Party. And again, that's also quite an effort. So the two front runners, at least those assumed to be, are the most extreme warmongers. And I would also say, concerning the Republicans, right, the Republicans had, for a time, attempted to camouflage themselves as libertarians, as isolationists, whatever it is. It's a lot of bunk. The Republicans are exactly the warmongers that you've seen, that you know them to be, and that will extend to all of them. Because remember, when you look at a field like this, what you're really looking at are figureheads, and what the policies of these administrations will be. This has a lot to do with the handlers around them, who will then become the National Security Council, right? The cabinet officers, defense, treasury, state, attorney general, you know all these, right? So Bush has put out a list of the people that he will rely on as his advisors, and one of them is none other than Paul Wolfowitz, right? Arch neocon, warmonger, fascist madman of the Bush
It's
years,
like
right?
It's like a bad nightmare.
Yeah, it's a bad nightmare. It's
usurped my entire. This has usurped my entire life. I just want it to be over.
Well, let's try to knock them out of the box. Now, remember, the complicating factor for Wolfowitz was they gave him the job of head of the World Bank, and he was knocked out of that post because he had this mistress, and he was favoring her. Right? She was an official, I believe, Arab origin, which made it strange because of Wolfowitz's, Arabophobia, whatever he had, Islamophobia. But this woman was his mistress, and that essentially a lot of foreign countries refused to deal with him, right? Saying, not only are you a warmonger, but you're suffering from moral turpitude here, buddy. So we're not going to even talk to you. And eventually it became impossible for him to do the job, and then he had to leave. So that's that side. Hillary is reported to be somewhat more discreetly trying to reinvent herself. She's trying to bring in a bunch of experts to tell her what she should think about any number of issues. I would just say with Hillary, we saw the woodenness, the inflexibility, right, the triumphalism, the inevitability complex, the sense of entitlement, all of these very difficult and retrograde characteristics that she had. All of these were on display in 07 to 08. You have to think about it. The only way Obama was able to beat Hillary was by gaming the Democratic delegate selection process, figuring that they couldn't beat her in many states, but that they could outflank her by going to places like the Wyoming Democratic Caucus, right? The Wyoming or the Alaska Democratic Caucus. The Democrats in these states meet in a telephone booth, but they nevertheless have significant numbers of delegates. So Obama was able to almost defeat Hillary. In reality, Hillary got more popular votes and indeed more delegates, but some of those were taken away by the Democratic National Committee. But even so, the idea, Hillary, friend of Wall Street, right? Absolute bosom buddy of the Wall Street hedge fund hyenas and zombie bankers. And then at the same time, Hillary, the warmonger, Hillary practically a neocon.
Yeah,
I think this is not going to be...
You think the long shot prophecy that we had a year ago about Ben Sass ticket is off the table. Ben Sass, Rand Paul, Vice President Rand Paul ticket. They've been meeting together a lot in private.
They have, sure, and we'll see, right? And remember, even though he went around saying, whatever year it was, or he was going to be the 44th or whatever.
Yeah, the 45th president.
That that's not written in stone, right? He's going to be eager to take any bone that the bankers throw him, right? Because he's a banker, professional bankers. So he could emerge. If he's going to do it this time around, he'd have to do something in the next 3 or 4 months. So let's see. Right? We'll be aware of it. Also, the fact that we denounced this far and wide also has some effect. Right?
Yeah.
May offer a deterrent. I don't know. The fact that this has been denounced by us in Nebraska and elsewhere. This plays a role. Who else?
They might think they need some time to regroup after we exposed all their pedophilia scandals and stuff.
It might be too quick.
Yeah.
You don't know. It can't be doctrinaire. Nobody's got Nostradamus. And,
No, of course.
Those were important points to make, and we got to keep making them. But now, Biden, the interesting thing about Biden is the one guy who said that it was the Saudis and other allies who financed the terrorists coming out of Syria, including ISIS. He's on record saying that, so that's interesting. Biden, of course, on the other hand, is the one who wants to break up Iraq into 3 separate nations. Who else do you have? Actually, one of the most bland and benign of all of these people is Martin O'Malley, former governor of Maryland, who actually he managed to do a couple of things. He got DREAM Act approved, he got gay marriage instituted, and he abolished the death penalty.
Oh, okay.
So that might be of some interest. The problem is this is exactly the guy who's struggling to get any attention at all. Then we have Elizabeth Warren, always posturing.
Let's take our last 6 minutes to cover her, because that's going to be a big one.
You got a couple of others. Elizabeth Warren, I believe she's a very weak person. She's essentially a petty bourgeois, good government activist. Now, but she doesn't really proceed from a theory of economics or anything of the sort, but rather that there's a scandal of corruption going on. Well, that's certainly true, but it leaves her incapable of thinking of anything in depth. In other words, she wants to tell you what a wonderful thing the Consumer Financial Protection Agency.
And our premise at the Tax Wall Street Party is that we have squeaky clean government, what's that going to... We spend all our time focusing on that. What's that going to do for people now who are suffering tonight?
It will not save working families that are threatened by destruction. It won't.
Exactly.
Neither will campaign finance reform. The Securities and Exchange Commission, no matter how much money it has, will not save them. But look, here's with her. She just did a couple of self-serving, strutting, self-congratulatory interviews about this wonderful financial...
I just want to say one thing really quickly. I mean, campaign finance reform is becoming, like we were talking about in the very beginning of the show, like global warming, another religion. I've seen people come to tears. So
I'm sorry, but that's
right.
Petty bourgeoisie. What's with her, right? She's out there talking about the student loan debt. Well, of course, the one good thing that she ever did, the one substantive thing that she did, and this was, I immediately tried to help this as much as I could. I was not sectarian at all in regard to her, was that she said that at least for the year 2014, that students, or maybe the academic year 13 to 14, look at it that way, September to June, that student loans should be made available through the discount window of the Federal Reserve System at 0.75%. The argument being that's the rate at the discount window. If I'm a zombie bank, I can get it for 0.75, and the student has to pay much more, 5, 6, 7, 10, 12%. So her original position was that the money should come, and this was absolutely clear, that the money would come from the Federal Reserve, and that they would be forced by Congress to do this. So this had many, many interesting aspects. Read the write-up that we have at Topley.net and probably elsewhere. But the problem was, as soon as the Democratic Party hierarchy said, look, you want to be in the leadership, you back off from that, she backed off immediately. She dropped it like a hot potato, and her best proposal for the interest rate on student loans then became 3.75.
It's above 3%, almost 4%.
Yeah, so 3 or 4% more, and that, of course, that's an immense difference. Now, so this was a craven capitulation. In other words, this was real political cowardice. And that would be fine, except that she's always strutting with her.
Yeah, but that's an omen of what's to come. I mean, look, that's what the future is going to be, capitulation.
Okay, and then there's more. Trans-Pacific Partnership. Okay, this is a monstrosity. Free trade is a loser. Giant sucking sound of U.S. jobs going away. It's true. No doubt about it. We've now had 20 years of experience. So Elizabeth Warren's op-ed in the Washington Post of today is there's a feature of the Trans-Pacific Partnership which allows the lawyers, not even judges, but lawyers working for the International Authority of the Trans-Pacific Partnership to override U.S. law, to override U.S. contracts, to deprive unions of their rights, a whole catalog of horrors. And at the end of it, you expect her to say, stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership and let's have a 15% protective tariff instead of this free trade hokum. Oh, no, it's only, Elizabeth Warren says, it's okay to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but you can't have this one mechanism in it. Whereas, of course, in reality, the whole thing is a monstrosity. Okay, one more. Bernie Sanders, he's uncertain. This is a guy who is, on paper, he's in favor of a Wall Street sales tax. He gets on television quite frequently. He never talks about anything substantive. He's willing to sit there and answer questions for Ed Schultz or whatever dummy is talking to him. And, he's big on the Trans-Pacific, the Keystone Pipeline and so forth. Then you have the strange guy, Jim Webb, right? The former Secretary of the Navy, former Senator from Virginia. And this is a kind of ill-defined, right-wing, Democratic candidate. It hasn't taken on a whole lot of...
we got 5 minutes, so we need to get to Chicago.
Yeah, but anyway, there is this guy, Jim Webb. I could go through a lot of stuff on him. He's a Scotch-Irish activist. He thinks it's great to fight. He's a Marine. I once was in his house. He used to have a house right over the Iwo Jima Memorial. Right? So he'd look out of his window in this expensive condominium duplex, and he'd see the flag going up on Iwo Jima. So he's got a lot of that stuff going on. So this is sort of it's like a right-wing, fairness, take care of people. It's very hard to define, but generally a fraud and generally completely empty. Now, the news for these Democrats is the following, right? We just had the Chicago primary for mayor, and here we have Rahm Emanuel, one of the most odious right-wing Democrats in the pack. This is a Wall Street Democrat writ large. So he's out there in Chicago. He was, of course, part of the Clinton administration. He was a part of the Obama administration. He was a congressman for a while, too. And he's now the current incumbent as mayor of Chicago. What has he done? Union busting, especially targeting the teachers' union, shutting down 50 schools, destroying the neighborhood school concept, I'm sure, huge emphasis on charter schools and similar things, and just generally a mayor at the beck and call of the banks, of the corporations, full of contempt for working people.
And he's got a competitor now coming up from behind, this Chewy.
Well, yeah, in other words, the Democratic primary round one has occurred, and Bozo, as we used to call him, Ram Bozo, referring to his level of intelligence. So Rambozo. This is Rahm Emanuel alias Rambozo. He wanted to sail through and to get the Democratic nomination on the first round, but the strange Chicago system, you need to get 50%, and he didn't get it. So this guy, Jesus Garcia alias Chuy, Chuy, he got 37% of the vote. There were a couple of others. There was one rich guy who spent a lot of money. Rahm did not get the nomination now in his pocket, so he's going to have to fight a second round. And
you have to keep. We're out of time. We're going to have to keep our eye on Chewy, but look, he's qualitatively better than Rahm Emanuel.
The idea is